In a city where corruption reached from the streets to the highest offices, a group of men moved to dominate, to remind those beneath them of their place. When they saw the woman alone in her wheelchair, rolling steadily down the sidewalk, they thought they had found an easy target. She was small, unassuming, outnumbered. They saw weakness where there was none. They saw someone they could break. What they failed to see was the warrior beneath the surface. Aaliyah Carter had spent years mastering the art of survival, her training honed in war zones, her mind sharper than the predators circling her now. A former Navy SEAL turned high-ranking federal agent, she had fought terrorists, outmaneuvered mercenaries, and taken down men far more dangerous than the ones who thought they had her cornered. But to them, she was just another woman, just another name they would forget by morning. They were wrong. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. The midday sun hung high, casting sharp shadows across the sidewalk as Aaliyah Carter rolled steadily forward, her posture composed, her expression unreadable. The city bustled around her, commuters rushing past with their heads buried in phones, vendors calling out their lunchtime specials, the occasional car horn punctuating the air. To any ordinary pedestrian, this was just another afternoon. But Aaliyah Carter wasn't an ordinary pedestrian. She had sensed them the moment she left the FBI headquarters, long before they made their presence obvious. A seasoned soldier didn't need to see danger to know it was there. She had felt the change in the air, the subtle shift of movement, the slowing of passers-by, the weighted gaze of men who had picked their target and were preparing to strike. She caught their reflection in a storefront window, 3 men stepping out from an alley across the street, eyes locking onto her. A few seconds later, 2 more emerged from the opposite direction, spreading out just enough to look casual. But she saw the coordination in their steps. They were positioning themselves. Aaliyah didn't react, didn't reach for her phone or adjust her course. If they thought she was oblivious, they'd get sloppy. And she wanted them sloppy. The leader, a wiry man with a shaved head and pale blue eyes, stepped directly into her path, forcing her to stop. His grin stretched too wide, teeth yellowed from tobacco. Tattoos covered his forearms, but the one on his collarbone caught her attention. A black sun symbol. She had seen it before. White supremacist insignia. Well, well, he said, his voice slick with amusement. Didn't expect to see your kind rolling through here all alone. Aaliyah remained still, letting him talk. The taller one to her right let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. She's real quiet, huh? Thinks she's too good to talk to us? The third, younger but with the same ugly glint in his eyes, scoffed. Nah, she thinks we won't touch her. 'Cause people like her get special treatment, don't they? Yeah, the broad-shouldered one sneered. You think that fancy little chair makes you untouchable? That people are gonna feel real sorry for you if something happens? The leader leaned down slightly, his grin widening. Maybe we ought to teach you how the world really works. The moment his hand shot forward, Aaliyah moved. Her fingers latched onto his wrist before he could make contact, twisting it with expert precision. A sharp crack echoed as pain shot through his arm, forcing a yelp from his lips. He stumbled forward, but before he could regain his footing, Aaliyah used the momentum to yank him past her, sending him sprawling onto the pavement. The others reacted immediately. The broad-shouldered one lunged from the right, aiming to grab her from behind. Aaliyah spun her wheelchair, slamming the reinforced metal frame into his knee. A sickening crunch filled the air as he howled, buckling onto one leg. Another grabbed at the back of her chair, but she had already anticipated the move. She gripped his wrist and yanked downward, pulling him off balance and sending him face first into the pavement. The wiry leader pushed himself up, eyes burning with rage. You piece of shit! He rushed her. Aaliyah waited until the last second, then jerked back, her chair rolling just enough for him to overextend. As his momentum carried him forward, she drove her elbow into his ribs, knocking the breath from his lungs. He crumpled, coughing violently. Get her! One of them snarled. The remaining 2 hesitated for only a second before charging at the same time. Aaliyah exhaled, her grip tightening. The fight was far from over. Aaliyah's grip on the wheel of her chair remained firm, her breath steady even as the gang surrounded her. The wiry leader wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his pale blue eyes dark with rage, nostrils flaring as he forced himself upright. The laughter, the cocky sneers, those were gone. Now there was only humiliation fueling him. "Think you're tough, huh?" he spat, his voice laced with venom. The broad-shouldered one limped, clutching his knee where she had slammed her chair into it. But the pain in his expression was overshadowed by seething fury. "I say we really show her what happens when you mess with the wrong people." Aaliyah's hands flexed slightly against the frame of her chair, every muscle in her body prepared for the next strike. They had come into this expecting easy prey. Now they were scrambling, their pride wounded, and that made them more dangerous. "Circle her!" the leader barked. The others obeyed immediately, tightening their formation, cutting off any chance for an easy escape. They were learning from their mistakes. Two of them moved behind her, trying to cut off her movement. The broad-shouldered one took her left side, still favoring his injured leg, but determined. The wiry leader stood in front, flexing his fingers as if testing how much pain he could ignore. Aaliyah's mind calculated every possibility. She wasn't about to let them control the fight. The younger one made the first move, rushing in from behind. She heard the shift in his stance before she saw him, a telltale shuffle of weight before a strike. Just as his arms reached to grab her, she ducked low, then whipped her chair to the right, using the full force of her body to drive the frame into his ribs. He grunted, stumbling sideways, crashing against the nearest building. The second attacker behind her tried to capitalize on her movement, reaching out to grab her shoulder. She let him, just long enough to trap his wrist, twist sharply, and send him flipping over her lap. He landed on his back with a heavy thud, the air rushing from his lungs. The leader wasted no time. The moment she was momentarily distracted, he lunged, this time with purpose. Aaliyah had expected hesitation, but he moved faster than before. She barely had time to dodge before his hands slammed onto the arms of her wheelchair, gripping tight. "Not this time," he hissed. Aaliyah reacted instantly. Her hand shot forward, striking him directly in the throat. Not enough to crush his windpipe, but enough to make him gag. His grip faltered, giving her just enough room to push off and create distance. But the broad-shouldered one was already moving. His injured knee be damned. His breath came in sharp, ragged bursts, a mixture of anger and stubborn determination driving him forward. He swung a wild punch, his thick fingers curled into a meaty fist. Aaliyah blocked it with her forearm, absorbing the force, but she felt the impact vibrate through her bones. He was strong, stronger than the others. His sheer mass made him dangerous, but he was slow, reckless. His face twisted in frustration as he grabbed for her again, thick veins bulging in his neck. Aaliyah didn't let him get a second chance. She threw her weight into a controlled spin, angling the chair so the reinforced footplate smashed into his shin. Bone met metal with a sickening crack. He let out a strangled cry, stumbling back, his knee buckling beneath him. His hands shot out for balance, but his weight worked against him. He nearly toppled, barely managing to catch himself on the rusted edge of a nearby dumpster. She could win this. She would win this. Then, the metallic snick of a switchblade broke the air. Aaliyah's head snapped toward the sound. The wiry leader, the one with sunken cheeks and a perpetual smirk, now held a small but deadly blade in his right hand, flipping it between his fingers with unsettling ease. His eyes, dark and narrow, held no hesitation, only the sharp gleam of someone who enjoyed moments like these. "You had your fun," he said, voice low and steady, his confidence solidified by the steel in his grasp. "Now let's see how tough you are when you're bleeding out." The others grinned, emboldened by the shift in advantage. The gangly one with the mismatched hoodie and frayed sneakers let out a breathy chuckle, his earlier hesitation vanishing behind a veneer of false bravado. The short one, the one with the scar along his jaw, cracked his knuckles, his grin widening as if he could already see how this would end. They thought the weapon had changed things. Aaliyah shifted slightly, calculating. If he thought a knife would make her hesitate, he was dead wrong. The broad-shouldered one sneered, his mouth curling around a bitter laugh as he steadied himself. He glanced at the leader, wiping a streak of sweat from his brow. Just got her already. The youngest of them, the one still catching his breath, hesitated. His brown eyes darted between Aaliyah and the knife, something unspoken flickering behind them. He took a half-step back. He wasn't ready for this to go further. Aaliyah took the brief pause to prepare. She tightened her grip, her mind already working through her next move. If they thought she was trapped, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. The leader advanced first, blade glinting under the sunlight, as he feinted toward her left side before striking fast toward her right. Aaliyah didn't fall for the fake out. She reacted the instant his weight shifted, jerking her wheelchair back just enough for the blade to miss by a fraction of an inch. His arm was now extended, open, vulnerable. Aaliyah snatched his wrist before he could retract, twisting violently. The knife clattered to the ground. He howled, his body following the force of her motion, and she used his momentum to slam him face first into the pavement. His cheek scraped against the rough concrete, a streak of red left in its wake. The others froze. For the first time, uncertainty crept into their expressions. He groaned, dazed. The broad-shouldered one moved next. Aaliyah ducked his first strike, then countered with a swift elbow to his solar plexus. He gasped, doubling over. She seized the opportunity, grabbing his arm and yanking him down onto his already injured leg. The cry of pain that followed was satisfying. The others hesitated now, their confidence crumbling. The leader was on the ground, coughing. The broad-shouldered one was clutching his leg in agony. The youngest was staring at her with wide eyes, clearly reconsidering his life choices. The sirens were getting louder. One of them cursed under his breath. "Cops!" The wiry leader, face bloodied, pushed himself up onto shaky hands. His rage was palpable, but even he knew when the fight was lost. "We'll deal with you later," he spat, before turning on his heel and staggering away. The others scrambled after him, dragging their wounded as they disappeared down the alley. Aaliyah exhaled slowly. She let them go, for now. She adjusted her sleeves, rolling her shoulders as the distant wail of sirens grew closer. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. This was just the beginning. Aaliyah Carter adjusted her sleeves as she sat in the police station, her expression unreadable as Detective Lisa McGraw flipped through the paperwork in front of her. The sterile white walls of the precinct felt suffocating, filled with the low murmur of officers discussing cases and the occasional ringing of a desk phone. Outside, sirens wailed as a patrol car sped off to another emergency. McGraw, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s, set the papers down and let out a tired sigh. She had seen Aaliyah before, not in this context, but at government briefings where FBI intelligence intersected with local law enforcement. She knew who Aaliyah really was, but right now, the lieutenant wasn't sitting in her official capacity. Right now, she was just another civilian reporting a crime. 5 of them jumped you in broad daylight, and you put 2 in the hospital? McGraw's lips twitched slightly, somewhere between disbelief and admiration. That's a hell of a story, Carter. Aaliyah kept her tone measured, her posture relaxed. Not a story, a report. McGraw exhaled sharply, leaning back in her chair. The officers on scene took statements from bystanders. Security footage backs up your version of events, and medical responders confirmed one of them has a broken kneecap. She flipped a page idly. But I'm guessing you didn't come here expecting us to solve this for you. Aaliyah met her gaze, unwavering. I don't believe this was a random attack. McGraw arched a brow. They didn't take your wallet, didn't steal your phone, didn't run until they realized they were losing. So yeah, I'd say that tracks. She paused. You want to tell me what you think this was? Aaliyah tapped a finger lightly on the table, considering her words. These men weren't just some street punks looking to make trouble. They were organized, coordinated, and they didn't just pick me at random. They were waiting for someone like me. McGraw frowned, flipping back to the description of the gang members. "Do you recognize any of them?" Aaliyah hesitated for only a second before answering. "Not their faces." "But their insignia." She leaned forward, lowering her voice slightly. "One of them had a black sun tattoo." McGraw's jaw tightened. That was all the confirmation Aaliyah needed. McGraw tapped a pen against the desk, her mind visibly piecing things together. "We've had scattered reports of groups like that operating in this city. Not big enough to make national headlines, but enough to stir up trouble in certain neighborhoods. Harassment, intimidation, sometimes worse. But they're smart. They don't wear uniforms, don't march in the streets. They blend in, and if you're right about them targeting you specifically," she exhaled through her nose, "they didn't know who you were, did they?" "No," Aaliyah's voice was firm. "If they had, they wouldn't have walked away." McGraw considered this for a long moment before finally nodding. "All right, I'll have my officers look into their known associates, see what sticks. But we both know it's not going to be that easy." Aaliyah knew exactly what she meant. These men weren't just street thugs. They had backing, resources, people covering for them. A few arrests wouldn't dismantle whatever they were building. "I'll handle it from here," Aaliyah said, already pushing away from the desk. McGraw sighed, rubbing her temples. "I figured you'd say that. Just don't do anything that forces me to clean up after you." Aaliyah didn't promise anything. Back in her apartment, she sat at her desk, fingers gliding across her laptop keyboard as she pulled up a secured connection. The official police reports would take time to process, but she wasn't about to wait on bureaucracy. She navigated through a series of encrypted files, cross-referencing known extremist activity with gang-related incidents in the city. The black sun tattoo wasn't just a generic hate symbol. It was an indicator of deeper connections. It wasn't just a gang sign. It was a recruitment mark. Her eyes narrowed as she found a pattern. Several incidents of harassment and violent attacks in predominantly black neighborhoods, all suspiciously underreported, all following the same tactics she had just encountered. And then there were the missing persons reports. Names that didn't make the news, but whose disappearances aligned too closely with known gang activity. This wasn't just about intimidation, it was about control. Aaliyah reached for her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the one she needed, Marcus Reynolds. She pressed the call button. It rang twice before a voice picked up, deep and smooth, with the kind of calm that only came from years of seeing combat. "Didn't expect a call so soon," Marcus said. "Something tells me this isn't a social check-in." Aaliyah's fingers drummed lightly against the desk. "I got jumped today. 5 men, coordinated. They didn't know who I was, but they knew who they were looking for." Silence. A fraction too long. Then Marcus exhaled. "You all right?" "Bruised, not broken," she replied. "But that's not the problem. They weren't just a gang. They were testing something, pushing boundaries, seeing how far they can go before someone stops them." Marcus didn't respond immediately, but Aaliyah knew he was already processing the information. "Black Sun?" he asked finally. "One of them had the tattoo," she confirmed. Marcus cursed under his breath. "That's not small time. That's a movement. And if they're getting bold enough to try something like this in daylight, it means they think they have cover. Then we take it away from them," Aaliyah said, a beat of silence. Then Marcus chuckled, low and knowing. "That's why you called me." Aaliyah leaned back in her chair. "I need you on this. I don't trust anyone else to watch my 6. Another pause, then a sigh. "All right, I'm in. Where do we start?" She glanced at her screen, the reports, the patterns forming right in front of her. "We find out who's protecting them." The night air was thick with humidity, clinging to the city streets like an unseen weight. Aaliyah Carter sat in the passenger seat of a nondescript black SUV, eyes locked onto the dimly lit warehouse across the street. The building was in a neglected part of the city, the kind of place where no one asked questions, where business was conducted in the shadows, and where bodies disappeared without a trace. Beside her, Marcus Reynolds adjusted the lens of a high-powered camera, his face partially illuminated by the glow of his laptop screen. His fingers moved deftly over the keys, switching between surveillance feeds he had tapped into. The warehouse had no exterior security cameras, but Marcus had found a workaround. Hacking into a nearby traffic light control panel had given him limited but useful visuals. "They're moving product," Marcus murmured, zooming in on a group of men unloading crates from the back of a blacked-out van. "That doesn't look like drugs. Too organized. Too careful." Aaliyah adjusted her earpiece, shifting slightly in her seat. "Weapons? Could be. Could also be something worse." Marcus clicked a few keys, enhancing the grainy image on his screen. "We won't know for sure unless we get closer." Aaliyah exhaled, watching as a tall figure emerged from the shadows of the warehouse entrance. Derek D. Rock Mason. She recognized him immediately. He had the stance of a man who thought he was untouchable, shoulders squared, expression unreadable, his movements casual but full of authority. Mason wasn't just a street thug. He had connections. He had power. And the fact that he was out here personally overseeing whatever was happening meant this was more than just routine business. Then, another figure stepped into view, and Aaliyah felt her stomach tighten. The man was different from the others. He wasn't dressed like a gang member. He wasn't one of the muscle-bound enforcers hauling crates. He was older, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, his posture stiff with the kind of confidence that came from knowing he didn't belong in a place like this, but also knowing that no one here would dare question his presence. Marcus muttered a curse under his breath, his hands freezing over his keyboard. "That's not just some buyer." Aaliyah studied the man carefully. He was wearing an expensive gray suit, the kind that screamed money and influence. His face was vaguely familiar, but it wasn't until Marcus pulled up a second screen, running the image through facial recognition software, that the pieces started falling into place. The results loaded in seconds. "Son of a—" Marcus hissed, leaning back in his seat. "That's Nathaniel Briggs, Department of Homeland Security, third in line for oversight on counterterrorism operations. What the hell is he doing out here?" Aaliyah's mind immediately started piecing together the implications. Briggs wasn't just any government official. He was someone with access to sensitive intelligence, someone who had the ability to classify or declassify information at will. If he was here, meeting with Mason, it meant one thing: this wasn't just a gang operation. It was protected. "We need audio," Aaliyah said, already reaching for the parabolic microphone in the back seat. Marcus nodded, adjusting the sensitivity settings as she pointed the device toward the warehouse. A soft click signaled it was live, and a moment later, their earpieces crackled with the sound of hushed voices. "Making too much noise, Derek," Briggs was saying, his voice low but firm. "We agreed that your men would keep this quiet. That means no daylight stunts, no headlines, and certainly no hospital visits." Aaliyah and Marcus exchanged a glance. This confirmed it. Briggs knew about the attacks. Mason's voice was calmer, smoother. "I don't control every dumbass on the street, Briggs, but I can make sure it doesn't happen again. You're still getting what you paid for." "That's not the point." Briggs sounded irritated now. "You're drawing attention, and if this operation gets flagged by the wrong people, I won't be able to cover for you. Do you understand how deep this runs? This isn't just about some street-level intimidation. We have bigger objectives, and if you screw this up, you're done. We both are." Aaliyah narrowed her eyes. "Bigger objectives." Marcus tapped his fingers against the laptop, his eyes scanning the audio levels. "They're working on something larger. This isn't just about scaring people into submission." Mason exhaled sharply. "Relax. We've already got shipments moving through, and nobody's the wiser. You'll get your cut, and the rest will go where it needs to go. Besides," he chuckled darkly, "by the time anyone catches on, it'll be too late." Briggs didn't sound reassured. "Keep it clean. No more headlines, no more slip-ups. I don't need this coming back to my office." Aaliyah clenched her jaw. There it was, confirmation that a sitting government official was protecting Mason's operation. But why? What were they moving? Where was it going? The conversation shifted as Briggs checked his watch, clearly eager to wrap things up. "We'll touch base again in a week. Make sure everything stays quiet until then." Mason nodded, and the two men shook hands before Briggs turned and walked back toward a sleek black sedan parked just outside the warehouse. The moment he drove off, Mason pulled out a burner phone and started making calls, barking orders to his men. Aaliyah and Marcus sat in silence for a long moment. Then, Marcus let out a slow breath. "This is big." Aaliyah's mind was already racing ahead. "We don't just have a gang problem. We have a federal corruption problem." Marcus leaned back, rubbing his hands over his face. "If Briggs is involved, that means high-level clearance. That means resources, government funding. That means—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Whatever this is, it's huge." Aaliyah's hands tightened into fists. "Then we take it apart, piece by piece." Marcus exhaled through his nose, nodding. "Agreed. But we need more than just surveillance footage. We need something that will bury them." Aaliyah glanced back at the warehouse, her pulse steady, despite the weight of what they had just uncovered. "We start with their supply chain," she said. "We follow the money, track the shipments, and find out exactly what they're moving." Marcus cracked his knuckles. "And once we have that," Aaliyah's lips curled into a cold smile, "we burn them to the ground." The early morning light filtered through the wide glass windows of the FBI headquarters, casting long shadows along the polished floors of the director's office. Aaliyah Carter sat opposite Director Jonathan Keene, her back straight, her expression impassive as the older man flipped through the surveillance photos she had just handed him. Keene, a man in his mid-50s with graying temples and a face lined from years of political maneuvering, let out a slow breath before leaning back in his chair. His sharp eyes lifted from the evidence and settled on her, unreadable. "You do realize what you're showing me, Carter?" His voice was measured, but there was an unmistakable weight behind it. Aaliyah didn't flinch. "I do." Keene tossed the folder onto his desk and steepled his fingers. "A sitting government official, Homeland Security no less, caught meeting with a known gang leader at a warehouse moving what could be illegal shipments. If this is what it looks like, it's bigger than both of us." Aaliyah nodded. "Which is why I need Bureau resources. Briggs isn't just covering for them. He's protecting something bigger. Marcus and I need to track the shipments, follow the money trail, and expose who else is involved before they can bury this." Keene exhaled through his nose. "This isn't as simple as kicking down doors and making arrests. If you go after a man like Briggs, you better have an ironclad case. Anything short of that, and this whole thing backfires." Aaliyah leaned forward. "That's why we don't go for him yet. We start with the gang, take their operation apart piece by piece, and force Briggs into the light. But I need access to financial records, shell companies, everything we can tie to their supply chain." Keene rubbed a hand over his jaw, thinking, "This doesn't leave this office, Carter. If word gets out that the FBI is investigating one of its own, you and I both know what happens next." She met his gaze head-on. "That's why I came to you first." For a long moment, Keene was silent. Then, with a slow nod, he reached for his secure phone. "I'll authorize limited resources. Quietly. But you're on your own for anything outside official channels." Aaliyah took that as a win. Later that afternoon, she met Detective Lisa McGraw at a small cafe a few blocks from the precinct. It was safer than the station, where too many ears might be listening. McGraw, ever practical, arrived in plain clothes. Jeans, a leather jacket, and her service weapon concealed at her hip. She slid into the booth opposite Aaliyah, ordering a black coffee before turning her full attention to the case files on the table. "You weren't kidding," McGraw muttered, flipping through the images of Derek Mason's operation. "Guns, cash, and now a federal connection? That's a cocktail for disaster." Aaliyah tapped a finger against the folder. "I need boots on the ground. Police presence. Eyes on Mason's key players. I have FBI support, but not enough to make a move yet. We need evidence tying the gang directly to Briggs before we pull him in." McGraw let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "You're asking for backup while half my department is already on their payroll. That's risky, Carter." Aaliyah arched a brow. "Are you on their payroll?" McGraw snorted. "If I was, I wouldn't be here." She closed the folder, exhaling. I can give you a few men. People I trust. But the moment this heats up, you can bet Mason's gonna find out. And when he does, he won't run. He'll push back. Aaliyah expected nothing less. Then we push harder. McGraw studied her for a moment, then smirked. You really don't back down, do you? Aaliyah's lips barely lifted. Not when I know I'm right. Across town, in a darkened warehouse filled with the low hum of activity, Derek Mason paced the floor, his expression tense. He had received the news an hour ago. Someone had been watching the drop last night. Not just someone, her, Aaliyah Carter. He clenched his jaw as his second-in-command, Leon Rourke, leaned against a crate of unmarked weapons. She's not just any target, D-Rock. She's a problem. If we don't shut her down, this whole operation gets exposed. Mason glared at him. You think I don't know that? That's why we're not waiting for her to come to us. We set the terms. Rourke's eyes narrowed. You sure that's a good idea? We don't even know how deep she's dug. Mason grabbed a nearby crowbar and slammed it against a wooden crate, the force making the room flinch. She's the one who doesn't know how deep this goes. She thinks she's playing detective, but she doesn't realize she's already lost. He turned toward his crew, his voice dangerously low. We don't run. We control. We set a trap, make her feel like she's got the upper hand, then we shut her down. Permanently. Rourke hesitated. Briggs won't like it if we make too much noise. Mason smirked. Briggs doesn't have to know. A moment of silence passed before Rourke nodded. All right, what's the plan? Mason's smirk widened. She wants to follow the money? Fine. Let's give her something to follow. That night, as Aaliyah sat in her apartment, poring over financial documents, an alert pinged on her screen. A flagged transaction. A new shipment being moved. It was exactly what she was looking for, but she didn't know yet. Mason wanted her to find it. She had taken the first step into his trap. The coordinates led them to an industrial lot on the outskirts of the city, where forgotten warehouses lined cracked asphalt roads, their rusted metal siding bearing the scars of years of neglect. The night was thick with silence, save for the distant hum of the highway and the occasional drip of leaking pipes echoing in the dark. Aaliyah sat in the passenger seat of Marcus's SUV, her eyes scanning the area ahead as she double-checked the flagged transaction on her laptop. According to the financial trail, a large sum of money had been wired from an anonymous offshore account to a logistics company registered under one of Mason's known aliases. That company had, in turn, paid for the delivery of unspecified agricultural equipment to this location. But there were no tractors here, no farming supplies, just empty structures, graffiti-tagged walls, and too many places for someone to hide. Marcus sat beside her, his hands resting on the wheel, his gaze sharp as he surveyed their surroundings. He didn't need to say it. He felt it too. Something was off. You see any movement? Aaliyah asked, keeping her voice low. Marcus adjusted the night vision binoculars, sweeping over the lot. Nothing obvious. No guards, no spotters. Either they think nobody's looking, or they want us to walk in. Aaliyah nodded slowly, closing her laptop. We do this smart. No direct entry. We scout first, then decide how deep we go. Marcus smirked. Scouting was always your thing. I was more of a kick the door in and improvise kind of guy. Aaliyah arched a brow. That's why you had twice as many concussions as the rest of the squad. He chuckled under his breath. Fair point. They moved carefully, slipping out of the vehicle under the cover of darkness. Marcus took point, his sidearm drawn, while Aaliyah maneuvered with precise control, keeping to the shadows. Years of training made their approach seamless, silent, methodical. When they reached the warehouse's side entrance, Marcus tested the handle. It wasn't locked. Aaliyah frowned. That's never a good sign. Marcus pulled the door open just enough to peek inside. The space beyond was empty. Too empty. No crates, no supplies, just a single work light dangling from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows across the concrete floor. Aaliyah felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. We need to pull back. Before Marcus could respond, the first gunshot rang out. The bullet struck the metal siding just inches from his shoulder, sending a shower of sparks into the darkness. Instinct took over. Aaliyah yanked back, spinning her chair as Marcus dove to the ground, both of them seeking cover behind a stack of rusted barrels. "Ambush!" Marcus hissed, drawing his weapon. "We got snipers!" Aaliyah scanned the rafters. Shadows moved along the beams. At least two, possibly more. They weren't shooting to kill. Not yet. They were trying to pin them down. A voice echoed through the warehouse, slow and mocking. "You should have stayed out of this, Mason." Aaliyah's grip tightened around the armrest of her chair. "You're getting sloppy, Mason," she called back, keeping her tone even. "If this was supposed to be a trap, you should have sprung it faster." Mason laughed. "Oh, don't worry. It's just getting started." Aaliyah caught movement to the right. 3 men advancing from the shadows, weapons drawn. Mason's crew. Marcus took the first shot, his bullet striking the nearest man in the shoulder. The thug let out a strangled yell, dropping his gun as he collapsed. The second one returned fire, but Aaliyah had already repositioned, staying low as the bullet struck the concrete just behind her. She moved fast, using the cover to her advantage. The modified frame of her chair gave her mobility most people never expected, allowing her to shift direction at angles that threw off their aim. She reached into her vest, pulling out a compact taser. The second gunman never saw her coming. As he moved in closer, she spun sharply, driving the electrodes into his side. The crackling surge of electricity sent him convulsing to the ground. The third man hesitated. Aaliyah took the opening. With a sharp jerk, she knocked his weapon aside and followed up with an elbow strike to the throat. He gasped, staggering back. Marcus fired again, taking out the last remaining attacker with a clean shot to the leg. The man crumpled, clutching the wound. Mason was already retreating. Aaliyah caught sight of him ducking through a side exit, his voice barking orders into a phone. "He's running," Marcus growled. "Let him," Aaliyah said, chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. "He just told us everything we needed to know." Marcus exhaled sharply. "That wasn't just a hit squad. He knew we were coming." Aaliyah nodded, which means someone tipped him off. They had a leak. Marcus's expression darkened. "We're gonna need to rethink our whole approach. We're playing on their board, and they know every move before we make it." Aaliyah pulled out her phone and opened a secure line. "Then it's time we stop reacting and start controlling the board." As Marcus secured the fallen attackers, Aaliyah switched screens, pulling up the financial data again. The offshore account that had led them here, it wasn't just linked to Mason. It was traced to someone even higher up. Marcus glanced over her shoulder. The name on the screen made his jaw tighten. Senator William Hargrove. Aaliyah's eyes burned with realization. "We weren't just following Mason's operation. We just tripped over the people funding it." Marcus let out a low whistle. "That explains the cover-ups. Explains how Mason's crew is operating with impunity. Hell, it explains Briggs." Aaliyah clenched her jaw. This wasn't just about a gang terrorizing black neighborhoods anymore. This was a system, an infrastructure designed to empower and protect them while ensuring their victims never saw justice. Mason had led them into a trap, but in doing so, he had exposed something even bigger. Aaliyah looked up from the screen, her voice steady. "We take them apart, one piece at a time, from the bottom all the way to the top." Marcus smirked. "Now you're speaking my language." The safe house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of the old floorboards beneath Marcus's boots. The warehouse ambush had forced them to relocate quickly, ensuring no one could track them back to Aaliyah's apartment. Now, inside a small, secured rental property on the city's outskirts, they had a moment to breathe, but not to rest. Aaliyah sat at the worn wooden table, staring at the scattered documents, photos, and open laptop in front of her. The blue glow from the screen illuminated the sharp angles of her face, highlighting the tension in her jaw and the slight furrow in her brow. Marcus stood near the door, arms crossed, watching her. He knew that look. He had seen it too many times before, back when they were deployed, when the weight of an operation rested squarely on her shoulders. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was calculation. A woman sifting through chaos, trying to find the thread that would pull everything together. He sighed, stepping forward. You gonna say something, or are you just gonna stare at those files all night? Aaliyah didn't look up. You realize what this means, right? Her voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. Marcus leaned against the wall, tilting his head. That we just walked into an ambush set up by one of the most powerful gangs in the city? That they knew we were coming, meaning someone inside law enforcement tipped them off? That we now have proof this entire operation is being backed by a sitting U.S. senator? He let out a low chuckle. Yeah, Carter, I'm well aware of what this means. She finally looked up at him, her dark eyes locked onto his with an intensity that had nothing to do with frustration and everything to do with exhaustion. No, Marcus, it means we're in a war. We can't win. The words sat heavy between them, an admission neither of them wanted to say out loud. Aaliyah exhaled, rubbing her temples. You know how this goes. We're not just dealing with street-level criminals anymore. Mason is just a cog in the machine. If we go after him, we don't just get pushback from his people. We get pushback from the people protecting him. Briggs, Hargrove, and God knows who else. She gestured at the laptop screen. They have money, power, influence. If we push too hard, this whole thing gets buried. We get buried. And nothing changes. Marcus studied her for a long moment before pulling out a chair and dropping into it. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, and let out a slow breath. You're right. We can't beat them their way. She looked at him, waiting. But that's the thing, Marcus continued, his voice measured. We're not here to fight them on their terms. We're not here to play by their rules. He tapped a finger against one of the photos, one of Mason shaking hands with Briggs. This right here. This is leverage. They think they can shut this down before it ever reaches the surface. But what they don't get, what they never get, is that people like us don't just quit. Aaliyah scoffed, shaking her head. You sound real optimistic for a man who just dodged a sniper bullet. Marcus grinned, but it was sharp, serious. Nah, I just remember who we are. He sat back slightly, folding his arms. They want to intimidate us. They want us to be scared. But Carter, look at what just happened. Mason went out of his way to set up a trap for you. That tells me one thing. She arched a brow. And what's that? Marcus smirked. You scare the hell out of them. Aaliyah let out a breath, leaning back in her chair. She wanted to dismiss it, to tell him that intimidation wasn't enough to win this fight. But she knew he wasn't wrong. Mason had panicked. Briggs had been forced to step out of the shadows, and now, with Hargrove's name tied to the operation, they had a path, one that could take them all the way to the top. It wasn't about overpowering them. It was about exposing them. Marcus leaned forward again, his tone softer now. Listen, I get it. We're up against people who don't play fair, who have connections we can't even see yet. But we've already done something they didn't expect. He gestured at the evidence scattered across the table. We pulled them out of hiding. And now, they're reacting. They're making mistakes. Aaliyah let his words sink in. For the first time since the ambush, she allowed herself to acknowledge what they had truly uncovered. They had proof that this wasn't just about Mason's gang. They had traced the money, linked it to a U.S. senator, and confirmed that a DHS official was actively covering for them. That wasn't just a local scandal. That was national. And if they played this right, if they gathered enough undeniable proof, this wouldn't be a battle in the shadows. It would be a reckoning in the light. She inhaled deeply, nodding slowly. All right, Marcus raised a brow. All right, what? She gave him a knowing look. All right. Let's burn their entire system to the ground. A slow grin spread across Marcus's face. Now, that's the Carter I remember. Aaliyah pushed back from the table, already switching gears. First step. We need another way in. We can't rely on official channels anymore. If there's a leak, it could be anywhere. So we go independent. We dig into Hargrove's financials, his connections, his donors, find out how deep this goes before we make a move. Marcus nodded, already pulling out his laptop. And what about Mason? Aaliyah's expression turned steely. "We hit his operation. We force him to make a mistake. And when he does, we'll be ready." Marcus cracked his knuckles. Now that's a plan I can get behind. The weight that had settled over Aaliyah's chest earlier had lessened, replaced by something stronger. Resolve. The war had just begun, but for the first time, she wasn't just fighting against something. She was fighting to win. The industrial docks stretched out before them, the air thick with the scent of salt and oil. Towering stacks of shipping containers cast long shadows under the harsh glow of floodlights. The port of Belmont was one of the city's busiest cargo hubs, a place where legitimate business blurred seamlessly with underground operations. Tonight, it was about to become the site of Mason's first real loss. Aaliyah adjusted the earpiece connected to Marcus, who was stationed in a blacked-out van parked 2 blocks away, monitoring surveillance feeds from a hacked security network. The two of them had spent the past 72 hours identifying and tracking Mason's supply lines, pinpointing key distribution points, and feeding the gang carefully fabricated intelligence. Now, the bait was set. "Eyes on the target," Marcus's voice came through, smooth and steady. 2 black SUVs just pulled up near Warehouse 17. 5 guys so far. No sign of Mason yet. Aaliyah, perched on a rooftop overlooking the dock, peered through her binoculars. The men below moved with purpose, unlocking the warehouse's massive steel doors. Inside, she knew, was supposed to be a fresh shipment, except there wasn't one. She and Marcus had made sure of that. Instead, the crates inside were filled with nothing but scrap metal and junk, planted to look like a botched delivery. Enough to make Mason's crew panic, enough to make them act without thinking. "They're moving inside," Aaliyah murmured. "Any sign of law enforcement?" "McGraw's people are staged 2 blocks over, waiting on your signal. If this goes right, we don't just disrupt Mason's operation, we cripple it." Aaliyah smirked. "Then let's make some noise." She pulled out a small remote detonator and pressed the trigger. A loud bang erupted from the far side of the dock as an old abandoned fuel drum exploded into a fireball. It wasn't strong enough to do real damage, but it was enough to send the gang into a frenzy. "Shit!" one of the men below shouted, pulling his gun. "Go! Move! Find out what the hell that was!" Another barked. They scattered, weapons drawn, searching for an enemy that wasn't there. Marcus's voice cut in. "And just like that, they're playing right into our hands." Aaliyah didn't respond. She was already moving. She maneuvered down the fire escape swiftly, rolling onto the pavement with practiced precision. Keeping to the shadows, she made her way toward the warehouse's open doors. Inside, 2 of Mason's men were frantically pulling back the tarp covering the crates, expecting weapons and contraband, only to find worthless metal scraps. "What the fuck is this?" one of them growled, kicking the crate in frustration. The other yanked out his phone. "Calling Mason." Aaliyah acted before he could dial. She surged forward, striking hard with her elbow, sending the phone clattering to the ground. Before the man could react, she twisted his wrist and forced him down, locking him into a brutal joint hold. He let out a strangled yelp as his arm bent in the wrong direction. The second thug spun toward her, gun raised, but before he could fire, a single shot rang out. Marcus. The bullet struck just above the man's hand, making him drop the gun in alarm. A second later, Marcus emerged from the shadows, his own weapon trained on them. "Don't try it," he said, voice calm but firm. "Unless you want the next one to land somewhere more painful." The 2 men froze, one still groaning on the ground, the other raising his hands in surrender. The trap had worked. Outside, sirens wailed as McGraw's team swarmed the area. Squad cars pulled up fast, officers flooding onto the docks. The remaining gang members were caught completely off guard. Within seconds, they were surrounded, weapons confiscated, forced to their knees as they were cuffed and read their rights. Aaliyah took a slow breath, watching as the takedown unfolded exactly as planned. Mason's operation had just lost a key shipment. His men were in custody, and the best part? They had been the ones to walk into it. Marcus stepped beside her, watching the scene with satisfaction. You gotta love when a plan comes together. Aaliyah's expression remained neutral, but there was a sharp glint in her eyes. This was just step one. Marcus glanced at the arrested men being shoved into the back of patrol cars. You think they'll talk? Aaliyah exhaled, watching McGraw oversee the transport. They will, one way or another. She turned to Marcus, her voice lower now. These guys weren't the real prize. They're just runners. The real question is, who was Mason expecting to meet here? Because it sure as hell wasn't just his usual crew. Marcus's smirk faded slightly. You think it was another buyer? Aaliyah shook her head. I think Mason is diversifying. Whatever his gang is moving, it's not just guns anymore. There's something bigger at play. And I want to know who was supposed to pick up this shipment. She glanced at her watch. We'll know soon enough. The moment they hit holding, we start breaking them down. Marcus crossed his arms. And if they don't talk? Aaliyah's gaze darkened. They will. I'll make sure of it. The cold white light of the FBI interrogation room cast long shadows across the wall.